Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I wanted to talk about one of the subsystems that is an optional mechanic that can be very useful, either when you're running the game or when you're playing the game and you want to stop things from dragging and you want to resolve violent situations in a rather quick manner. Because a lot of us do not read the books cover to cover. Maybe we have played under a storyteller before and we think we know how the game is working, but we skip over a lot of the optional stuff and we don't really take advantage of the full array of systems that we have available to us. For that, I would like to bring people's attention to the down and dirty combat rules. Because as I said in a previous video not all that long ago, one of the things that really helps streamline your chronicles for this setting, that really helps make your games feel smooth and fast-paced, is to think of them cinematically, not just in terms of how we're describing things or what's going on, but to construct them in terms of film and the language of film and the language of storytelling. And a lot of the time, we end up in the weeds. We end up thinking too much about the mechanics. We end up thinking too much about how many points an enemy has, how many health boxes are still left, all of those little minutiae, rather than getting into what is this scene supposed to feel like, how is it supposed to look, how are we going to resolve this in a way that feels organic to the story. And one of the worst ways to bog things down is to spend an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, 2 hours, going through round after round of combat that really isn't supposed to matter. As an example, let's say you were running a hunter game, as I currently am, which is one of the reasons I'm becoming so familiar with these rules, and your cell wants to work their way down into the lair of a vampire to kill them. Perfectly normal. However, if you get down there, that's when you have the round-by-round, pound-for-pound, knockdown, drag-out fight with the actual antagonist that you're going after. You don't want to spend that same energy and have that same amount of risk for the nightclub bouncers who are watching the door upstairs, which is stage 1 of the 3 stages down you need to get before you finally get to the boss fight. And that's where these rules come in. Because down and dirty combat is first and foremost a thing that players have to request. So as a storyteller, you need to make sure that they're aware it's an option. Whether that's bringing it up when combat starts, if you think it's appropriate, or just making sure that your players read through it and know that they can choose to do that if they so desire. Because it is not risk-free, there are just different risks associated with it. However, rather than going round by round, here's the brief way that down and dirty combat actually functions. So, you've reached a situation where a fight is going to break out, and your players have asked, hey, can we use these rules for it? And you, as the storyteller, look it over and say, yes, this is not meant to be a serious, linchpin, important fight. This is not a boss battle. This is not something that I want to be a major part of the story. For lack of a better term, this is one of the several dozen fights that John Wick gets into in the street. This is not him and another named antagonist in the film having a big moment. So, you decide, okay, you want to get past these bouncers that are watching the door so that you can actually move on and get to the rest of the vampire's lair beneath this nightclub. Perfectly fair. What you do, once you have established that you want to use these rules, is you will go player by player and you will ask, what is your goal in this fight? Because players who are working together to achieve the same end, they can be put together and they can use the teamwork rules to increase their odds of success. But there might be some players who are working on a different goal or who are doing something different with their characters, and they will have a separate pool. For example, you might have 3 characters who decide, yes, we are going to rough up these bouncers who are pretty sure are ghouls, and we are going to stop them from preventing us from going through this door. Perfectly fair. But let's say there's a 4th player. That player wants to pick the lock on the door while the fight is going on so they can just go through immediately. Okay, they're not part of the combat pool. They will be given a lockpicking thing to do on their own. And now, say you have one more player who maybe they're not a combat character. They want to sort of stand as lookout, and they want to prevent people from coming and providing backup to the antagonist. So they're slightly down the hall, and they're watching out for anyone coming. Also perfectly fair, they will get their own dice pool for their perception to see what's going on. Once you know what everybody is doing, you assign your dice pools. The people who are actually involved in the fight, depending on how they're doing it, will have either strength or dexterity plus brawl, firearms, or weaponry, and the NPCs will either use a similar pool. Obviously, if they don't have weaponry, they're not going to be using that. If they don't have guns, they're not going to be using firearms. But whatever their appropriate combat pool is, they will roll that if they're resisting. If they are not resisting, if they are trying to leave, they would use something like strength or dexterity plus athletics because they're trying to get away. Once everyone has figured out what their dice pools are, both the people involved in the fight and the people who are not involved in the fight, you resolve pools around the table. So let's start with the fight, since that's the violence that this is concerned with. You have your players, whoever is the point man. They get their bonuses from people who is participating in the teamwork. So let's say 2 of them are helping, 1 of them is the main fighter. The 2 helping will roll their dice pools, all their successes, add bonus dice to the main person. Point man then rolls their dice. You, as the ST, then roll the NPC's dice pool. You compare the 2. When you know the difference between the successes, you find out which side won and which side lost. If the players get an exceptional success, 5 or more successes on their side over yours, they both achieve their original goal, and they get a point of willpower because it went so well. Regular success, they did what they wanted to. They deal damage equal to their weapon modifier plus their successes. They kill their enemies if that was the goal. That is, again, one of those things. It's very important to understand what the goals are, because if you don't want to kill your enemies, you just want to subdue them, this is a thing you need to make the storyteller aware of, and you need to make sure you're using an appropriate dice pool. You can't be blowing off shotgun rounds and expect people to just survive to fight another day, obviously. However, if they fail, then the NPCs deal them damage equal to the number of successes that they got over the player characters. And they escape, unless, of course, the NPCs want to press things. A dramatic failure, same as a regular failure, players take damage, but the PCs are also stunned, gaining that condition, by how badly that went. And you could probably resolve this situation in less time than it took me to explain how these rules work. And that is why it's important to really consider this whole optional rule setup for combat, because anyone who has sat down and run a combat with 4 to 5 players and who knows how many NPCs, all of them against one monster is bad enough. All of them against a room full of monsters or an entire squad of antagonists, that's going to take at least an hour to resolve. And there are so many ways that could just go sideways and lead to unexpected results, because dice are finicky, and an exploding 10 in the wrong place can very quickly lead to player character death. It could lead to someone being permanently crippled if you're using those rules of long-term scars, loss of limbs, etc. And if you're going to run that risk, generally speaking, you want to have something worth that risk on the line. You don't want that to be something because you got in a random alley brawl with somebody who was accosting you. You don't want it to be, we were fighting a bunch of low-level mooks and the dice were mean to us that night. That doesn't make for good story. It's the same reason, again, when you're watching an action movie, our protagonist never gets horrible, crippling wounds from some random guy unless they're purposefully trying to upend that trope. And that is why it's really a good idea to use this, both because it acts as a bit of a stopgap against players getting horrendously bodied by your NPCs, but it also saves you so much time, energy, and effort, because sometimes you want that fight to be really cinematic. You want everyone to pull out all of their weird stuff. You want all of their powers, all of their best strategies on full display, and you want them to feel like this is an important epic moment. But if the fight is not that important, if it's just against a bunch of random NPCs, or it's a bunch of low-level characters that are just supposed to be kind of an appetizer for the fight to come, don't run the risk that it turns into something worse than it is. But again, this is one of those things that players need to choose it. So while you as the storyteller could urge them of, hey, this fight's really not going to be all that important, if you want to do it the long way, I am here to do that for you guys, but if you'd rather just resolve this and move on, we could do it the fast way. And just as importantly, if your players think that they could do something quickly, and they ask if they could use the rules, but you've decided, no, there's actually more going on here, you could inform them, it's like, no, that is not an option for this fight. Which could put them on their toes if you want to change things up and play a little bit of Find the Queen. So keep that in mind as well, of sometimes it is really good to go through the full production for combat, but sometimes if it's just a thing they need to do in order to achieve their goals, if it's just a stepping stone in the way of getting through this door or finding this clue or managing to get a piece of information out of somebody that they're going to rough up, there's a time and place for everything. And sometimes you don't need to spend half your game session resolving a fight that really doesn't matter in the long run. So use these rules as you wish. It is a tool, and like all tools, it'll help in some situations, it won't help in others. But it is a thing that a lot of folks overlook or just never try out because, for them, there's no reason to do things quickly. You just want to get neck deep into it and see what happens. So, to each their own with this one. I just wanted folks to know it exists because it can save you a lot of time, energy, and effort as a storyteller, and it can really keep things running smoothly because you don't want your players so disconnected from the actual plot they're following because they just spent the last hour and change trying to make sure their character didn't die of a horrendous knife wound because one of your random drunk NPCs happened to get lucky with a broken bottle. But, as always, let me know what you want to see in future episodes. Leave some comments down below as to other mechanics in the games you would like to see covered, as to other systems you'd like me to look into. I have been getting a lot of requests for some of these. I am doing my best to acquire the books and to find time to get through all of them. So if you have been asking for those, please be patient with me. Reading time is not as easy to come across these days as I'd like, but I am doing my best to dig through and to keep putting new stuff out there. Keep your eyes out there for everyone who enjoyed my last Hunter release. I should have a new one coming out soon. And until next time, happy gaming, everybody. Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Ezekiel Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.